Hello and welcome. I want to begin this lesson by showing you a couple of way cool maps. This first one shows the entire 48 states divided up into all the counties nationwide. And it shows you through a series of colors, in particular shades of green, which area, which locations around the country have the largest percent land area devoted to farming. Now, one thing I want you to keep in mind, this map obviously is intended to show you which parts of the country have the most agriculture, but I want you to consider the possibility, imagine in your mind, if you will, that instead of showing percent of land area devoted to farming, as this does, and I realize I haven't really defined that term yet, that instead what it would show is the total number of acres devoted to farming county by county nationwide. And it would color the counties darker if that county had more acres devoted to farmland than some other counties. Well, under that type of accounting system, so to speak, where the higher acre counties would get colored darker, then it's possible that the map would be less effective in showing what it wants to show. Why? Because the counties on the western half of the nation here, being larger as they are, would naturally tend to have more acres devoted to farmland, even if the density, the commonality, if you will, of agriculture in that county is even less than some areas that are to the east. And yet they still might be colored darker than some areas east. So in order for us to accurately describe what's going on in terms of what areas of the country have the greatest degree of agriculture, we have to find a way to level the playing field, so to speak. We need to describe the amount of agriculture not in terms of total acres, but in terms of what fraction of the total area in the county is devoted to agriculture. And if it's most of the area in that county, be it large or small, that county should be colored more darkly than some of the other counties. Well, that's what apparently the makers of this map would agree with us, because that's exactly what they've done in coloring the counties according not to the total number of acres, but to the percent of land area devoted to farming. If the percent of land area, as you can see in the legend in the lower left there, is between 80 and 100%, in other words, between 4/5 and 100%, and all of the if it's somewhere between 4 out of 5 acres and all of the acres in the county is devoted to farmland, then it's colored that darkest shade of green. Similarly, if we find that it's between 3 and 4/5 of all the acres in the county, then it has that lighter shade of green. And there are steps of lighter and lighter green all the way down to a pure white color there for counties in which between 0 and 1/5, 1 out of every 5 land acres is devoted to agriculture. Those areas are colored white. So what we see here is truly what I think the makers of the map would want you to see, and which is more useful to see, quite frankly. We don't want this to be a map describing which counties around the nation have larger amounts of area. That's not very useful. But to describe the areas nationwide that have the highest density of agriculture, how common is agriculture, then this is the right kind of map to use here. Here's another example, now not taking a look at just our country, but as the world as a whole. And this is taking a look not at agriculture, but at poverty levels. Well, this map is clearly intended to show which areas around the world have the most poor people. And again, just like in our previous map, there are two ways in which we can try and describe that. The first way would be to assess with each individual country which countries have the largest total number of poor people. That's one way to do it. The other way to ask that question is to ask which country around the world has the highest fraction of the total people who are poor? In other words, is it half of the population that's poor? Is it a third of the population that's poor? Is it a fourth of the population that's poor? What exactly is it? And so there's two different ways in which we can show this. And so here again, if we are to show the total number of people, that may not be nearly as useful information as to show which country has the highest fraction of its total people that are actually poor. If we're going to take a look at countries that have the highest total population of poor, in particular countries like China and India, both of which have a population above 1 billion, have would almost certainly show the highest numbers of poor people, even if those highest numbers reflect a smaller fraction of the total people in that country. So it's far more useful to us to see which countries have higher fractions of the total numbers of people who are poor. And we can see here that the countries that have those highest totals are in fact not China, not India, but mostly countries in Central and Southern Africa. And so that information is far more useful. Again, by using fractions of a total, which we can oftentimes describe in terms of percents, we can come up with a product or a description of reality that's far, far more useful than what it would be if we didn't have this information. So using that information, we're actually going to get into percents today. But let's first take some time for ourselves, a minute of focused breathing time to get ourselves in the now, to be completely here in the moment. Take some time for yourself. Welcome back. Let's take a moment to describe actually what the meaning of percent is. As it turns out, it is basically just means number out of 100. Percent. It comes from the same origin as dollars and cents. How many cents are there in a dollar? As it turns out, it's 100. And so when we say per cent, we're really almost literally saying per hundredth. And so with that in mind, converting a percent to a fraction is to simply say that this is the number out of 100 that we're working with. So converting a percent to a fraction simply involves either dividing it by 100 or multiplying it by the reciprocal, 1 over 100, which in this case just gives us 7 over 100. Some more examples of this: 56%. Again, in converting a percent to a fraction, we either divide it by 100 or multiply it by 1 over 100. You can see here we're multiplying it by 1 over 100 to give us 56 tenths. That's not in its lowest form, so we do want to convert that to a more simple form, and we can do that by dividing top and bottom by 4, in which case 56 becomes 14 and 100 becomes 25. 125%, once again, we're multiplying that by 1 over 100 to give us 125 100ths. That fraction can also be simplified further to give us 5/4. Lastly, 0.4%. Now this one is a little bit different in that it is less than 1%. And so as we're multiplying this by 100 here, we are going to be getting a fraction that is actually 4/10 times 1 over 100. Another way you could see this is 0.4 over 100, where you have an odd decimal sitting in your numerator. Well, you can change that decimal to a whole number by moving the decimal point one space to the right. That's the equivalent of multiplying it by 10, and what you do to the top, you have to do to the bottom, and so 0.4 over 100 becomes 4 over 1,000. You can see that presented in another way here, in which we simply say 0.4 is the same thing as 4/10. In fact, that's another way of saying 0.4, 4/10. We multiply that by 1 over 100 to get another example of what we were looking at. Oh, and I forgot to mention above that 5/4 can be converted into a mixed number, 5/4 being equal to 1 1/4. We have converted a series of percents to fractions. Oh, and of course, 4 over 1,000 can also be reduced by dividing top and bottom by 4. That gives us 1 over 2/50. 1 2/50. So, converting percents to fractions is what you just saw here. Let's convert some percents to decimals. Again, we are dividing by 100. In fraction land, we can do that by multiplying by 1/100th. In decimal land, that usually involves just moving the decimal place 2 spaces to the left, or multiplying it by 1/100th, which is 0.0. There's a lot of ways to say this. That gives us 0.07. So you can see that as multiplying 7 by 0.01, or you can simply see it as taking the decimal point on the number 7 and moving it 2 places to the left. Either way, you're multiplying it by 1/100th or dividing it by 100. All of that is the same thing. In the same way, converting decimals to percents involves moving the decimal point 2 spaces not to the left, but the opposite of that, moving it 2 spaces to the right, because in this case you are not dividing it by 100, you are multiplying it by 100. So 0.07 becomes 7%. So here's some more examples here. 31%, how do we move the decimal point? Well, what we're doing is we're dividing it by 100, or multiplying it by 1/100th. 1/100th as a decimal is 0.01. You can see it either one of those two ways, or you can see it in the third way, in which we're just moving that decimal point 2 spaces to the left, and we get 0.31. 6.5% is the same procedure. We're multiplying that by 0.01, and we get 0.065. 428%. This is interesting in that this is a percent, probably not the first one that we've looked at like this, but almost the first one that we've looked at, which is actually more than 100%, which means that as we move the decimal point 2 spaces to the left, it's still going to be greater than 1, and so we're still dealing with a quantity that is very, very large, comparatively large to any other percents that are less than 100%. 1 3/5%. Now I want you to think about this. Are we multiplying this number by something that's going to make it, when we're taking 1 3/5% of something, is that going to be larger than the something, 1 3/5 of it, or is it going to be much smaller than the something? 1 3/5 of something is just a little bit more than 1% of that. This is something that's going to be far smaller than the something that we're dealing with. 1 3/5 converted to a decimal probably is the easiest way for us to do this. 1 3/5 becomes 1.6, which when we move the decimal point 2 spaces to the left becomes 0.016. We could also do this in fraction land by converting 1 3/5 to an improper fraction. That would be 8/5. Instead of dividing by 100 or moving a decimal point, now we're multiplying it by 1 over 100. Remember, all these things are equivalent to each other. So we have 8/5 divided by, or multiplied by 1 over 100th. We multiply those fractions across, and we have 8 over 500. We could actually reduce that fraction to 4 over 2/50ths and reduce it further to 2 1/25ths. And as it turns out, that would be, it's a little bit more than 1%. So it's mathematically equivalent to 0.016. That fraction is the same thing as this decimal. So there's a lot of different ways to get to the same answer, just so long as you use one of the appropriate techniques. 0.05%. That kind of looks like some of the numbers that we have when we've converted something away from being a percent. Like if this were 0.05, that would be the same thing as 5%. But this is 0.05%. This is much smaller even than 1%. This is a very small portion of the thing that we're working with. And it's reflected in the fact that when we move the decimal point not to the right, but 2 spaces to the left, we get a very, very small number indeed. Here's some other examples. Now we're converting back from regular numbers that are not percents to numbers that are percents. Now we're moving decimal places back to the right. 0.62 is the same thing as 62%. Notice I'm multiplying this by 100%. Now what's interesting about this, and this is another way in which you can try and look at this as well, 100% of something is the same thing as all of it. So for example, if you are considering 100% of 7 apples, well, that's just 7 apples. Now, what other number outside of the realm of percents, when you multiply it by something, doesn't change it? That's the number 1. So even though you're changing the number when you multiply something by 100%, you're actually not changing the quantity at all. It's a little strange to say that because the number is changing, but you're going from a number that's not a percent to a number that is a percent. And in that transition, the number has to change in order for the quantity to stay the same. So multiplying by 100% gives us the same quantity expressed as a percent, but 0.62 now becomes 62%. In the same way, 1.75, we're multiplying this by 1. Multiplying this by 1. And then the result that we're getting is 175%. 1 of something, again, that shouldn't change it. We talked about that as well. 1 of something, well, multiplied by 100%, that's 100%. As we mentioned earlier, 0.004, think about what that's going to look like when we move the decimal point 2 spaces to the right. That's going to be less than 1%. It's going to be 0.4%, or 4/10 of 1%. Lastly, 8.9, when we move the decimal point 2 spaces to the right, is going to be 890%. Converting a fraction to a percent. Now, you might be thinking, ugh, this is going to be so different than before. But remember, all we're doing is multiplying the number by 100%. And we can do that when something is a decimal. We can just as easily do that here as a fraction. In this case, it's 100 over 1%. That's exactly the same thing as 100%. And when we do that, we get 300 divided by 5, which can be reduced to simply 60%. 3/5 is the same thing as 60%. We can do something similar with 2/3. When we multiply that by 100%, just like before, we get 200/3 of a percent. That's a little strange until we convert it into a mixed number, which converts to 66 2/3%. So think about this. If you were to give away 2/3 of a dollar, that would be 66 2/3 of a penny. 66 pennies and 2/3 of a penny. Some more examples. Well, in this case, we're not dealing with a fraction. We're dealing with a mixed number, but the procedure is the same. Think about what we'll have to do differently here. What extra step we'll have to put in? Well, it's simply converting this mixed number to an improper fraction, 9/4, and then just proceeding as before. This becomes 900/4, which can be reduced to 225%. That makes sense when you take a look at the mixed number before it. 2 wholes and 1/4, 2 and 1/4. Those 2 wholes would be 200%, and that extra 1/4 would be another 25%. So you can see how that further makes sense. 13/10 is already being shown to us as an improper fraction, so all we have to do is multiply it by 100%. That gives us 1300/10, which can be reduced to 130%. Some more examples. 5/13. Well, that's going to be pretty challenging when we multiply that by 100%. That's going to be 513%. Well, that takes a little while to figure out exactly what that is. 13 goes into 50 3 times. 3 times 13 is 39, leaving us with 11 left. We bring down the next 0. 13 goes into 110 8 times. 8 times 13 is negative 104. We subtract that off and get 6. Now we're crossing the decimal points. You'll notice this is 6.0. And to answer this, we're actually ignoring the decimal point for a moment. How many times does 13 go into 60? And the answer is 4, but we've now crossed that decimal point, so it's 0.4 now. 4 times 13 is 52. We subtract off 52. We have 8. And once again, 13 goes into 80. 6 times 13 is 78. We subtract that off, we have 2, we bring down the next 0. 3 into 20 goes once. 1 times 13 is 13. We subtract that off, we get 7. So we could continue to go on, and I believe we discover that at some point the decimal goes on forever, but it has a repeating pattern. For now, let's just round it off to the nearest hundredth of a percent. So it's 38 and 46 hundredths of a percent here. So in summary, you can see that there are 2 worlds that we work with in which we convert numbers back and forth. One of those 2 worlds is a percent, and the other of those 2 worlds is not a percent. Now, we've worked with fractions and decimals and all those kinds of things. What I want you to keep in mind is it's possible to express a percent as a decimal. It's possible to present a fraction as it's possible to present a percent, to present a percent, to present a percent, say that 3 times fast. You can present it as a decimal or a fraction. You can also represent something that's not a percent as a fraction or a decimal. So fractions and decimals can be on either side of this continuum. What's most important is not whether or not something's a fraction or a decimal, but whether or not it is a percent or not a percent. And simply put, the process of converting a percent or something that's not a percent to a percent is to simply multiply it by 1. Multiply it by 100%, that does the conversion. Similarly, in going from a percent back to something that's not a percent, you replace the percent sign with 1 over 100 or 0.01. And if you're working with a fraction, certainly you'll want to choose the 1 over 100. If you're working with a decimal, you'll choose the 0.01. Either way, you're dividing by 100 or multiplying by 1 over 100. Here are some example percents that convert to different fractions and different decimals. These are good to know just by heart in order to work fluently with percents in the modern world. 100% is simply the same thing as an entirety of something. It gets represented as a decimal as simply 1. We've talked about that. An example of this, of people who give birth, 100% are female. Only females give birth. 50% can be represented as 1/2. That as a decimal is 0.5. An example is of the population, 50% of the population is male. That's approximately true. That is, 1/2 of the population is male. It's actually slightly less than 50% is male. 25% is the same thing as 1/4, 1/4, or 0.25. An example is approximately 25% of the U.S. population smokes. That is, 1/4 of the population smokes. So 1 out of every 4 people. 75% can be represented as 3/4 or as 0.75. Approximately 75% of homes have computers, that is 3/4, 3 out of every 4 homes have computers. 10%, the same thing as 0.1. 0.1 can also be stated as 1/10. There's the fraction, 1/10. Of the population, 10% is left-handed. That is, 1/10 of the population is left-handed, 1 out of every 10. 20% is twice as big. It's 2/10 or 1/5. Can be represented as a decimal as 0.20. In a recent year, approximately 20% of the population of the United States was under age 15. That is, 1/5 of the population was under age 15. 1 out of every 5 people under the age of 15. 1% or 0.01, which another way to say 0.01 is 1/100th. There's our fraction, 1/100th. Approximately 1% of babies are born underweight. That is, about 1 in 100 babies is born underweight. We've talked about the last two just a little bit. In particular, we looked at the second of these two, 66 and 2/3%. That's the same thing as 2/3. And as a decimal, that's actually 0.6666666 out to infinity. 6 is going on forever. We represent that with the shorthand of 0.6 with a line, which I don't know is being displayed very well there, but there should be a line sitting above the 6. We say 0.6 repeating. Of the population, 66 and 2/3% prefers chocolate ice cream to other flavors. That is, 2 out of every 3 people prefer chocolate ice cream. I can understand that. The one above it, 33 and 1/3%. Notice that's just half of the one that's sitting below it, which was 2/3. This is now 1/3, or 0.333333. 0.3 repeating. A basketball player made 33 and 1/3% of her shots. That is, she made on the average 1 basket for every 3 shots attempted. So let's take a moment to fill in this particular chart here, in which I give you one of the forms, either a fraction, a decimal, both of which are not a percent, and then on the right-hand side, we're talking in terms of a percent. And so as you're converting from the 2 rows, the 2 columns to the left, those columns are not percents, but in the column farthest to the right, that is a percent. And you can see we can represent the number on the left, and those earlier 2 columns as either a fraction or a decimal. Either way, once you have one, let's see if you can convert it to the other 2. Let's start with 0.55. Well, that's pretty straightforward. We can convert that to a percent simply by moving the decimal point 2 spaces to the left. See if you can find some others that are a little bit, that are also just as straightforward. In fact, take some time to work on this yourself. Welcome back. Let's see how well your answers compare with the right answers here. 160% is the same thing as 1.6 when you're converting it out of percent land, so to speak. 2.4 converts to 240% in a way that's opposite what I showed you previously. 66.2%, that's one of those special percents that we mentioned earlier, which converts to a decimal 0.6 repeating. I think still that line isn't showing up very well, but hopefully you can understand that it should be there. 1.6, same thing as 1 3/5. If you took 0.6 and converted that to a fraction, 6/10 is the same thing as 3/5, and so 1.6 is the same thing as 1 3/5. 2.4, that's 2 4/10. Once again, 4/10 can be reduced to 2/5, so it's 2 2/5. 0.6 repeating, again, this is one of those special cases in which that's the same thing as 2/3. 0.55, that's 55 1/100ths, and you'd be able to divide the top and bottom by 5 to reduce that to 11/20ths. 2/9, that's the same thing as 0.2 repeating. You get that by remembering that fractions are division. And so taking 2 and dividing by 9, you would notice that you would get 0.222222222 ad infinitum. The result would be 0.2 repeating. And in the same way, if we move the decimal point 2 spaces to the right, well, we're moving it through 2 of those first 2 2's. So this is now 22.2 repeating. 22% with 0.2 repeating coming after it. We've already seen that 0.2 repeating is the same thing as 2/9. So, in a slight twist of fate here that might look like a little bit of sleight of hand, that's the same thing as 22 2/9%. Again, we start off with 0.222222222, and in moving the decimal place 2 spaces to the right, we now have 22.2222222. So it's 22% and something left over. But that something left over is the same thing as before. It's 0.2 repeating, which we've seen from earlier that that's the same thing as 2/9. So we can describe the fraction version of this percent not as 22.2 repeating percent. That was actually, that's a good answer as well. But if we're doing it as a mixed number, we can say 22 2/9%. Similarly, 1/200 is half as big as 1/100th. So you might have done this through a different route, going through decimals first to a percent, but I wanted to show this somewhat circuitous route to you as well. If 1/200th is half of 1/100th, which it is, then it's the same thing as half of a percent, or 0.5%. And that's the same thing as 0.005. You could also get the same thing by remembering that fractions are division and taking 1 and dividing it by 200. You would get 0.005.